Everyone, I wish to express my sincere thanks to my friend and colleague Ahmet Suzan for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to address some of my ideas, to convey some of my thoughts, theoretical and thoughts on the Turkish case. Let me begin by reminding you that Turkey changed its constitution in 2017, and after June elections 2017, these constitutional changes have become effective in full. So Turkey had before the changes, Turkey had a somewhat strange parliamentary system with a relatively strong president. Now it is some kind of a presidential system. But those who actually forged this system, who designed this constitutional arrangement, and those who support it politically, intellectually, they are aware of the fact that this is not an ideal, typical presidential system. So they invented a Turkish term. In Turkish they call it Cumhurbaşkanlığı hükümet sistemi, which it cannot be translated into any other language other than Turkish. Cumhurbaşkanlığı means presidency. So some of our colleagues who are working closely with the government as their academic public relations agency, like SETA, for instance, they invented the term presidency system as a kind of translation of Cumhurbaşkanlığı hükümet sistemi. But to be more honest, Ahmet Yılmaz'a, a member of parliament from the AK Party, and he was also a chair of the Constitutional Committee in the Turkish Parliament. He coined the term Turkey-style presidentialism, and I understand the adjective Turkish in the English language context refers to the territory as well, not only to the ethnic Turkishness, but also to the territory. When we say Turkish, it means belonging to Turkey. So we can say Turkish presidential system or Turkish-style presidential system if we don't want to use presidentialism a la Turca. And this process of governmental change coincided with an emergency rule. Actually, these constitutional changes and the referendum that took place, they all happened within the oppressive atmosphere of the emergency rule, which undermined its basis of legitimacy severely. But still, this is a coincidence of emergency rule and constitutional amendments. This is important for our discussion, maybe. And also, after these amendments, even before the referendum, and before the 24 June elections 2018, several institutions, including Council of Europe, declared that Turkey is not a democracy anymore. Turkey is a non-democracy. So this is a breaking point, I think, in the Turkish political developments in recent years, because before the amendments, or before the constitutional changes for Turkish-style presidentialism, Turkey used to be called a semi-democracy, a flawed democracy, or an electoral democracy, or maybe to some political scientists preferred O'Donnell's term, delegative democracy. But now it is an authoritarian system with an adjective. Competitive authoritarianism is the most popular, probably the most preferred term. and we use the term populist as well, populist authoritarian, authoritarian populism, competitive authoritarianism and populism, they go hand in hand. Here you see some of the leading indices I figured out during my research. VDAM is very interesting. It's actually, V stands for variables or variations, I think. It's a political science department project of Gothenburg University in Sweden. They actually measure some data. And this is interesting because they, according to their data set, they say the erosion of democracy in Turkey started in 2007, which is in line with Andrew Arato's depiction of Turkey's constitutional changes after 2007 as a majoritarian imposition, so not democratic. Anyway, in the same time, you see it again, 25th of April 2017, almost 9 days after the referendum, Council of Europe warned Turkey that it's moving away from the democratic path, but still, for the Council of Europe observers, Turkey is not a dictatorship. Let me say what I will say in the end. Now, I think the dictatorship is more appropriate as a concept. I'm not using dictatorship as a agitative or provocative political discourse. I'll come to that during my talk. Scholarship in the work of political theorists or political scientists, whichever term you might use, we see that Turkey is defined as an advanced democracy in those circles who are sympathetic with the president's and the AKP government's position. They said that the new system, Turkish-style presidentialism, eliminated what we know as the tutelary form of democracy and opened up the space for the full realization of popular will or national will. And this is an interesting fact of Turkish political life. Nation and people, so national and popular, are at the mainstream discourse, they are used interchangeably. In the beginning, in the 1920s, maybe I may have time to discuss that further later. In the 1920s, when the Republic was in the making, there was a distinction between what people are and nation, the identity of the nation. But that's another story. For those who criticize the current state of affairs, the Turkish-style presidentialism, Turkey is a competitive authoritarian regime, or most recently, two colleagues actually said Turkey is a dictatorship. Orhan Gazi Ertekin, who is a judge actually, but holds a PhD in political science from Middle East Technical University, he wrote an article in English saying that Erdogan's way is Caesarism. Turkey is actually in or nearing a situation of civil war, and that those conditions of civil war will produce a dictatorship which is closer to what the Romans had in the past, the Caesarism. He calls that. And Banu Bargu from Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz, who was my former colleague back in 2016 in the New School for Social Research. She wrote an article, year one, in a new journal, I think, and she says Turkey is a sovereign dictatorship. sovereign dictatorship, which is a concept used by a German constitutional lawyer and political theorist of the Nazi period. We know him quite well, Carl Schmitt. He has a book called Dictatorship, where he makes a distinction between a constitutional, temporary, he calls it kommissarisch, which means commissarial, with a mission. We'll come to that. So my purpose in this paper is to find the correct vocabulary or correct conceptual repertoire to account for what's going on in Turkey, and it also has a theoretical concern. Are we trying to explain what's going on in terms of cause and effect analysis, which is, I mean, you might prefer, or is the theoretician's task, is it to describe what's going on, or are we going to opt for a critical perspective to the political realm? I think I prefer the critical way of looking at things, and the critical way of looking at things is the way you theorize it, but you also want that your theory should have practical political consequences. You have to say something about the practice. So with this in mind, let's briefly look at the new institutions in the Turkish-style presidential system. We have, like all presidential systems, Turkey now has a monist and unipersonal executive, but as opposed to the ideal typical presidential government, Turkish-style presidentialism has an unaccountable president. It is written in the constitution. President is unaccountable, except the ballot box. So in elections to be held every 5 years, the president runs for the office for 2 times, for 2 terms. But other than that, there is no accountability. President is irresponsible. Mot a mot, word by word translation of the constitutional term is this, sorumsuz in Turkish, irresponsible. I know irresponsible has some other connotations in English, but maybe it's suicide. There is no, like all presidential systems, in the Turkish-style presidentialism, there is no organic link between the executive and legislative branches, but the separation of powers in the ideal typical presidential system is something that is instituted because we want checks and balances. The legislative must have checking, balancing powers vis-à-vis the executive transactions. In the Turkish case, the legislative branch, the Turkish parliament, has no power vis-à-vis the president's transactions. Only written questions can be submitted for ministers, not for the president. You cannot ask questions to the president. You can only ask questions to the ministers. And both the ministers and the president can be tried. This is a process that resembles impeachment, but it requires some qualified majorities to initiate and finalize the decision. So another issue decrease that might have the effect of a parliamentary act, a law, but some transactions of the president's office requires a parliamentary approval, but some transactions of the president, there's no need for a parliamentary approval. For instance, these might be good things. Declaration of emergency by the president requires a parliamentary approval immediately. Budget of the central state or deployment of armed forces. But president can appoint not only ministers, but also all high bureaucratic members of the central state administration, and no need for a parliamentary approval. Unlike the United States system, you don't need an approval in the Senate, for instance. And also there are grave problems in this system pertaining to what is known as presidential decrees. Now, for the presidential decrees, I don't want to go into a technical discussion of these, but there are several problems. The first problem is we have two words in Turkish. They both come from the same root. One is karar, which is decision, and the other is kararname, which is a decree, or sometimes it resembles to what the Americans call executive orders. So this distinction is there, but we don't know how it will resonate in the judicial section of the Turkish state. How the, for instance, Constitutional Court will qualify these transactions of the president's office. I mean, presidential decrees are subject to constitutional review by the Constitutional Court, but who's going to review the decisions? That is not known, and we still don't have an example. There are individual resolutions or transactions, like appointing someone for a high office in the bureaucracy. There will be, and there are, he still makes it, President Erdogan, issuing some bylaws or other regulations that clarify how a certain act or a statute law will be implemented. But this final aspect, the presidential decree with the force of law, we don't have that term anymore. We don't know how this is going to be tackled legally. When we say presidential decree in this sense, it resembles to the executive decrees with the force of law in the old system. In the old system, there was a council of ministers, and the council of ministers could have issued executive decrees with the force of law, but that competence of the council of ministers was dependent on prior authorization by the parliament in the form of a law. Without a prior authorization in law, the executive cannot issue decrees with the force of law. But now the president does not need a prior authorization by the parliament or a ex post facto approval of the parliament. He or she can issue decrees with the force of law at will. There are certain limits, but we don't know how the judiciary will adjudicate these issues. Like, for instance, the president cannot issue decrees with the force of law pertaining to fundamental human rights. But he recently issued a presidential, not decree this time, there's a confusion, a presidential decision saying that you cannot rent or sell your property with a price that is other than Turkish lira. Now, this is an interference with the right to property, for instance. But it is not a decree, it is a decision, it's a karar, not a kararname. So we don't know where we will go, to Council of State or to the Constitutional Court. Does it matter? Does it matter? Not very much, because institutions in Turkish-style presidentialism, the judiciary is under the control of the president. You may see it here. The most important judicial organ is the Constitutional Court and Council of Judges and Prosecutors, and the President's office controls almost all appointments in the Constitutional Court. 12 out of 15 members are appointed by the President, unilaterally, without any approval. 3 out of 15 by the Turkish Grand National Assembly, and Turkish Grand National Assembly has an overwhelming AKP majority, and AKP chairman is the President. This is the de facto situation. And Council of Judges and Prosecutors is a very important institution because this council appoints almost all judges in the Court of Cassation and Council of State. So if you control Council of Judges and Prosecutors, you also control the appointments in Court of Cassation and Council of State. And the President also has a power to appoint 1/4 of the members of the Council of State. And Supreme Election Council, that's also another. So, in short, the President in the Turkish-style presidentialism is irresponsible, controls the judiciary, it is not responsible or it is not answerable to the parliament. It has of course, the executive power, but it also has a good portion of legislative power, but that is not pronounced. After these changes, as they stand now, Turkish constitution is a constitution which has conflicting norms, but I don't want to go into that now, but it is a self-contradictory constitution as these changes now stand. So, and the whole architecture of this so-called Turkish-style presidentialism rests on certain principles. I mean, if you don't like the word principle here, I'm still doubtful about whether these are the principles or not, but instead of separation of powers, typical for a presidential system, the Turkish system opts for a concentration of powers. Concentration of powers in the office of the president. Instead of protection of liberty, it's stability and order. That is the emphasis, is on stability and order. Instead of consensus, deliberation, consensus building, etc., it is effectiveness. You have to be fast and effective. And the Madisonian fear of tyranny of majority in the American system, and I think that is the founding basis of an ideal typical presidentialism. We have a majoritarian understanding of politics. Now, these are not constitutional changes on their own, not only constitutional changes. These constitutional changes actually amount to what we know as a regime change. So, what is the name of the new regime? When you look at the political science literature, our colleagues writing on these topics, some of them emphasize that some dualisms are either eradicated or well, eradicated is a powerful term, but dualisms are still there, but they don't work as they used to work before. Like, for instance, inspired by Edward Shills, the late Professor Sherif Mardin wrote a very influential article, Center and Periphery, a key to understanding Turkish politics, with a question mark, but that question mark was answered by our colleagues in the mainstream Turkish political science. Yes, it explains center and periphery. So there's a central state and the periphery, which is the people, and the people is controlled by the central state, which is Kemalist, etc. So this is the Kemalist nation building. I mean, this has been written. But now the periphery came to the center and invaded all the institutions there. So this is a form of narrating things. This is a kind of explanation you might find in, for instance, Ersin Kalaycıoğlu and others. Similar to this, there's a dualism in the form of state and people, which this might stand for center and periphery, for instance, and supporters and critics. And I here mention the name of a colleague of mine from Middle East Technical University Department of International Relations, Necati Polat. There's a book by Edinburgh University Press, Regime Change in Turkey, that's the title. He argues that state-people dualism is on the way to become extinct. But he doesn't deny that the current situation is authoritarian or even dictatorial. He doesn't use the term dictatorship, but he says there is a certain mimesis. He uses this concept. The AKP is kind of a mimesis of the Kemalist single party period. So maybe this will lead to a democratization of the Turkish state and politics with the elimination of this distinction between state and people. But more importantly, and I think this is more important than the previous dualisms, is another dualism which the literature I cite here do not emphasize, but this is my approach to this literature. There's a theory of dual state by a German theorist, Ernst Frankl. He has a book in the 1940s, I think. And by dual state, he means we have a legal state, a state that is regulated, organized, even founded on legal basis. So this is what we might call the constitutional state. But he also says that there is an extra-legal dimension, and the state exists in two forms, a constitutional and constitutional legal form, and the state is subject to constitutional norms, legal regulations. This is what we know as a, if we might use the German term, Staatsrecht, rule of law state. But when we say rule of law, it's a term actually that the connotation, the main meaning of rule of law is prior to the state. So when you say rule of law state, or a state of rule of law, which is an awkward English term, I think, but you mean that there is a set of norms or rules, we call it law, and that law exists, rules of law. However, in the continental tradition, which Ernst Frankl has developed this idea of dual state, even in the French tradition or in the German tradition, it is, for instance, the French term for the rule of law is droit de l'état législatif. It is the law that is legislated by an organ of an established state that the state must be subject to. So this dual state has legal state or legal constitutional state and extra legal state, and I think this is present, this is something that we can detect not only in other continental European state traditions but also in Turkey. And we know this extra legal part of the state as perhaps deep state, if you will. The state that functions underground, maybe illegally. We know that state organs and individuals acting in the name of the state are doing illegal things, but still they are the workings of the state. So Polat's regime change and mimesis, his allegation, his claim that after AKP's this dictatorial mimesis of the Kemalist period, there will be this distinction between, this dualism between state and people will be eliminated, but what will happen to the legal, constitutional, and extra-legal or illegal state, we don't know. But dictatorial developments, Caesarism or sovereign dictatorship, the extra-legal or illegal state becomes dominant, and the rule of law, legal constitutional type of state either disappears or it doesn't disappear, but it's there, but it becomes subject to the extra-legal or illegal state. So that's what makes it authoritarian or dictatorial. Do I have time?
Yes.
Now, if this is a regime change from a semi-flawed, electoral, delegated democracy to an authoritarian form of politics, we also witness that Turkish political institutions, legal institutions, have been affected by this change drastically. Actually, the change destroyed whatever that was left as we know it in Turkey as kind of rule of law of a legislative state. So if we witness, if what we are seeing in Turkey is something like a destruction of the institutions, then there has to be something very close to what the political scientists today call populism. Because one of the most important tenets of contemporary populism, or populism has always been like this, it was anti-establishment. So if the rise of Erdogan to presidency, and presidency becoming the chief powerful organ of the Turkish-style presidentialism, this was something that is working against the Republican establishment as we know it, or as we knew it. In the literature, when you look at recent writings on Turkish politics, you will come across this term populism frequently, as well as competitive authoritarianism, etc. But some of them, but not all of them, mention that there is a relationship between populism and competitive authoritarianism. Actually, populism functions as a catalyst of competitive authoritarian systems. That is one argument by Levent. We see something similar to populism in Turkey as well. So we might jump into conclusions that Turkey has become competitive authoritarian and Erdogan is a populist. So what happens? This happens everywhere. So it's kind of, we don't like it, but it is normal, right? I mean, it happens in Thailand, it even happens in the heart of European Union, like in Hungary, there's a Poland, etc., and look at Brazil, even look at the United States. We have an authoritarian-minded, misogynist president there, who is even a proto-dictator, but he's surrounded by a powerful checks and balances system, so he can't move in a federal state with a strong Supreme Court, even a court system, etc. And we all know the American institutions, their powers, but we cannot be very optimistic about the US system. There are curious warnings coming from other political scientists. So Erdogan's position and Turkish-style presidentialism that we are talking about has some populist elements in it. But to work on a critical analysis of what's going on in Turkey within the parameters of competitive other types of authoritarian systems and within the context of a discussion of populism, I find it somewhat uncomfortable. There's something wrong with this. First, I think I feel uncomfortable because populism, as I said, one of the main tenets of populism was anti-establishment. So Erdogan, Turkish-style presidentialism, this destroyed the Republican establishment, if that's the fact. Then he's a populist because he was anti-establishment and anti-elite. Anti-elite, the elite was the old Republican elite. Probably now they have their own new elites for the new regime. But when we say this, when this is our argument, we opt a political option. We set forth a political option like we should restore the old establishment, the previous establishment. But previous establishment was bad, equally. But there were problems with the previous establishment. So if Erdogan is a populist that destroyed the old establishment, we have to restore the old establishment. I think this is something that makes me uncomfortable with the argument of populism. Another thing is, when we use the term authoritarianism with an adjective, we miss the dictatorial aspect. And we have to say, if this is a dictatorship, it's a dictatorship. Here I follow, who hasn't written on Turkey, actually, the French political theorist Eric Fassin. He has a book, The Great Resentment, I think that's the English title, but it's not translated into English. Interestingly, it's translated into Turkish. Büyük Hınç, that's the title. He wrote an article in this Open Democracy page. The article is entitled The Neo-Fascist Moment of Neoliberalism. Not talking about Turkey, but talking about USA, Europe, and other configurations called populist authoritarian politics, the rise of populist authoritarian politics. He says, these are not populists. or authoritarian. These are all neo-fascist, but the term populist conceals what's behind the scenes, and it softens dictatorship. And he also points to the fact that populism has good and bad versions. So right populism, right-wing populism is bad, like bad cholesterol, that's his analogy, but there's a good cholesterol, left-wing populism. And this coincides with the Turkish case, because in Turkish, when you translate populism, if you don't use populism, but is there a Turkish word? There's a Turkish word, halkçılık. And this dates back to 1920s, and 1920s debates around the principle halkçılık, which is derived from, which was in fact a translation of the Russian term narodniki in the 1910s, before the Soviet Revolution, before the Bolshevik Revolution. And halkçılık was something good, populism, because there was a class analysis at that time, and like the Soviet system, the dictatorship of the proletariat, there's a good dictatorship and bad dictatorship. Bourgeois dictatorship is bad, but proletarian dictatorship is dictatorship of the majority, because majority of the people are proletarian. So in the Turkish context, in 1920 assembly, commemoration of the 99th anniversary was yesterday, I think. In that very assembly in Ankara, people were debating who is the people. And the people who use the hammer in the factories, that's for sure, the laborers are the people. But what about the shopkeepers, or the lawyers, or the Muslims and non-Muslims? Non-Muslims, do they belong to the people? So from this background, when you say someone a populist, it may not be bad. Okay? I mean, it may be bad in our minds, in the minds of the opposition, but when you say, Erdogan, you're a populist, the supporters would say, of course, we are populist. We are for a populist democracy. But what they say, a populist democracy, is a populist dictatorship for us. So we should see what is there, and I think what there is fits to Carl Schmitt's perspective. That is my main argument. For Carl Schmitt, there are two conceptions of dictatorship. One is a derivation of the Roman Republican conception. If there's a crisis in the state, in the Roman Republic, you suspend the constitution, and a dictator for a limited period of time, for 6 months, to be extended maybe, but for 6 months, the dictator acts and restores the constitution without any legally binding normative framework. So this is a temporary commissarial dictatorship. This is something that corresponds to state of emergencies in constitutional democracies. Also, we have that in Turkey. But the Turkish constitutional system, in times of state of emergency, this time in 2016 to 2018, 2-year emergency rule, they destroyed all the extra constitutional state of emergency, which fits into the second conception of Carl Schmitt, sovereign dictatorship. Here now we have a form of dictatorship which also has a mission, but sovereign dictatorship's mission is not to restore an existing constitutional order in a crisis, but to constitute a new framework, a new state, maybe. So sovereign dictatorship is a founder for a new constitutional order. There is also an admission for that. But these are all ideotypical constructs, obviously. And why I am feeling closer to Carl Schmitt's sovereign dictatorship concept, because Turkey has had various times in history, Turkey has had deep political constitutional crises. The most well-known recent crises were 2007, when Turkish Parliament was about to elect a new president. The Chief of General Staff intervened in the process together with the CHP and the Constitutional Court. They blocked the election process by the Parliament, so we had early elections. Constitutional rules have changed for the election of president, so we opted for a president directly elected by popular vote instead of parliamentary form, etc. But this was it was not a crisis of constitution, it was a crisis of politics, in the sense Carl Schmitt used the term, because for Carl Schmitt, again, and this is also the picture in Turkey, I think, without a prior political decision on the nature of the nation state, you cannot establish a legitimate and valid constitutional order. So here we have a problem in Turkey, and that problem came to surface in 2011-2013 crisis moments, as you see. So we ended up with what we call de-democratization and deconstitutionalization. I cannot give you details because I've been talking for a long time now, and thank you for your patience. But deconstitutionalization is a fact, and if you ask questions, I can give you some examples. So Turkish-style presidentialism is a response to the political constitutional crisis of the Turkish state, and the president today, Erdogan, in the course of these electoral campaigns for the municipal elections, local government elections, before that, he always has this word, the vocabulary, saying that this is the endurance of the state is the problem. We have to protect the state. State always has a priority in the Turkish context, like the continental European context in critical times. State is prioritized vis-a-vis the law. So you can do illegal things if the state is, if you think that the state is about the
survival,
for its extinction, etc. So dual state in the Turkish case has become the legal constitutional state is now destroyed
or in
to an extent.
Or in hibernation.
Or in hibernation, maybe. Yeah. So, this may continue. This is likely to continue for a more crude, more oppressive forms of politics, with or without the current president. It doesn't matter, because the constitutional arrangement is typically an unconstitutional arrangement. I know this is a contradiction in terms, but it's a self-contradiction of the Constitution. So we will need a new paradigm in the future, and what I am trying to think about these days is to gather all these analyses together as a basis for thinking of a new paradigm, and that new paradigm will begin with realizing that there is no sovereign power that would found a constitutional state anymore. We are not living in the 18th or 19th centuries. In today's world, a sovereign constitution-making process is impossible. This is not a theory, but it is also a practice for Turkey, because even if we abolish this constitution today, we will still have restrictions for a future constitution that are jotted down in the Treaty of Lausanne. So there won't be a legal vacuum for Turkey. There will always be legal restrictions in international law or in other matters. So we have to be aware of the fact that there is no such thing as sovereign constitution making, so there won't be anything like a sovereign constituent power. This is something that should be acknowledged in the general public and in the elite minds. And another aspect of the future paradigm will be that there is no chance of a monocultural polity. So it has to be multicultural or pluralist